Hello, I'm Nick Ellis. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking me. I'm going to be talking about usage-based approaches to the acquisition of second language morphology. I'm going to be speaking quite quickly because there's a lot to say, but you can always go back because this is recorded. If you're interested in the PowerPoints for this presentation, then you'll be able to find them here. When I'm thinking about second language morphology, I'm taking a construction grammar, a cognitive linguistic view on language. I will say more. But I think of language, as did Saussure, as thought sound, patterns of sound, which wake up relevant patterns of thought in the people we're talking with. When I think about usage-based approaches, it's useful, I think, to think about Walt Whitman in his lovely poem, The Song of Myself, where he describes in this long poem the various people he knows, the woodsman, the fisherman, the bride, and he describes each of them, and then he says, and these tend inward to me, and I tend outward to them, and such as it is to be one of these, more or less, I am. And of these one and all, I weave the song of myself. And I think what he's saying is that I am the sum of all of the interactions with all of the significant people in my life. It works for selfhood, but it works for language too. Our language ability comes as the sum of all of the significant language interactions that we've had in our life. And usage-based approaches see language as a conspiracy of the memories of all of those language interactions. So I start from the point of view, I start from the observation that language knowledge and language processing is sensitive to frequency of usage. Many of the things I'm talking about today have already been published. When they are published, down the bottom in these little orange boxes, you'll find the article which I'm referring to. So psycholinguistics has shown us that language is sensitive to frequency of usage. How can that be? Well, it must mean that every episode of language processing has affected the language user's system. We don't get frequency from dictionaries or grammar books. We get frequency, the impact of frequency over our cumulative usage. Language learning is usage-based. So any acquisition model which ignores usage distributions is missing really important stuff. And we'd better understand this problem space, the language acquisition environment, our experience, which leads to our language competence. So I'm taking a cognitive linguistic point of view, usage-based grammar. We learn constructions. Constructions are symbolic. They're form, meaning, correspondences, conventionalized in the speech community, entrenched as language knowledge in the learner's mind. We learn constructions through using language, through engaging in communication. And our creative linguistic competence emerges from the collaboration of all of the utterances in a learner's entire history of language use and the frequency biased abstraction of regularities within them. And these are perspectives that are shared by cognitive linguistics, functional linguistics, psycholinguistics, corpus linguistics. It makes no sense to try to separate grammar from lexis, form from meaning, meaning from context, structure from usage. All of these are hugely interrelated. We can see this most clearly in the study of the acquisition of vocabulary. What is thought sound as far as vocabulary is concerned?
Today.
We're learning
Today.
This pattern of sound corresponds to this pattern of thought, or this pattern of interpretation. And what are the factors that affect vocabulary acquisition? Well, the factors are the usual factors, the usual suspects that drive associative learning. How often have we been exposed
Today.
to this thought sound? How often, how prototypical is the meaning? How high is the contingency between thought and sound? Some sounds correspond to lots of varying thoughts. Some sounds are very specific in their interpretation. How salient is
Today.
the thought, is the sound? How long is it? How regular is it? How imageable is the interpretation? There are other factors, but for vocabulary, we can think pretty much about these main driving forces. And these are things that Alan Beaton and I looked at in the early 90s, where we were looking at the second language vocabulary acquisition of German. And we showed, for example, that the second language word length is very important. Frequencies are important. The part of speech is important. The imageability is important. The phonotactic regularity. There are many psycholinguistic factors on this list which drive second language emergence. That was back in the 90s. Nowadays, you can go to recent review papers or experimental papers. Here's one predicting early lexical production. What's important? Concreteness, meaningfulness, imageability, frequency. Word frequency is the strongest classifier of whether a noun is produced. Here's a more recent paper by Cynthia Berger, Scott Crossley, Stephen Skalicki, looking at second language lexical decision. What factors drive lexical decision, response times or accuracy, frequency, contextual diversity, length, neighborhood side, concreteness. We know the sorts of things that affect vocabulary acquisition. These are papers from across this side of the pond. Here's some lovely review work by Elke Peters, review and experimental work by Elke Peters on your side of the pond, looking at the factors that drive single word learning. And what are those factors? Cognatehood, word length, part of speech, concreteness, polysemy, frequency. We can think of learning vocabulary from repeated exposures in usage. So we know a lot about learning vocabulary. We know too that there are different aspects of implicit and explicit learning which are important. The ins and outs, the perceptual and motor systems, the interfaces with sound are tuned by repeated experiences in specialist modules which develop to do that job. And that tuning is frequency based, and it is primarily affecting frequency, and timing are primarily affecting input and output. But equally importantly, the concept, the meaning in our mind requires explicit learning, multimodal episodes of explicit learning. So there are some tweaks. There are different aspects of, we have different means of learning, implicit and explicit learning, and a full picture of the acquisition of vocabulary investigates both of those aspects. There are explicit memory systems which do one-off learning, and there are implicit memory systems which tune the input-output systems. And there's a rich psychology of that too. And putting all of this together, you can now look to any of these very fine collections on the second language acquisition of vocabulary. We can do the same for construction grammar. We can think of verb argument constructions, syntactic constructions above the word level, and understand them in similar ways. And I'm not going into that here, but if you're interested in these things, we did this book 3 or 4 years ago now on usage-based approaches to cognitive and corpus investigations of construction grammar. And similar principles apply. And crucially important in all of this is corpus-based and computational approaches, because if we want to understand usage, then we need large corpora of usage to see what are the things that are impacting the system. So we know that language usage is highly patterned in ways that support learning. That language is never ever random. That language acquisition is guided by this patterning. That language users have rich implicit statistical knowledge of these patterns. Language processing is guided by this patterning. We learn from usage. It affects the shape of language, and it affects the shape of learners. And there are complex dynamics of meaning, saliency, attention, social communication, shared consciousness. And that this sort of understanding comes from the triangulation of cognitive linguistics and cognitive science, from the psychology of learning, psycholinguistics, applied linguistics, second language acquisition, corpus linguistics, NLP, computational approaches. We know a lot. It's an exciting time to be studying the acquisition of thought sound. So what do we know about morphosyntax, which is my major topic of the day? I'm going to be talking primarily about English as a second language, but I think all of these things apply to any old language, and I would love to see similar analyses of other languages as a second language. So we know the second language acquisition of morphology is particularly hard. It seems to be a lot harder than the acquisition of vocabulary. We know from single case studies like Schmidt's classic study of Wes, who learned naturalistically. He was very fluent with high levels of strategic competence, but low levels of grammatical accuracy. Describing Wes's English as a second language 5 years after he'd arrived in America, Wes said, Schmidt says, if language is seen as a medium of communication, as a tool for initiating, maintaining, and regulating relationships and carrying on the business of life, Wes has been a very successful second language learner. However, if language acquisition is taken to mean the acquisition of grammatical structures, then the acquisition approach may be working, but very slowly. Using 90% correct in obligatory contexts as the criterion for acquisition, none of the grammatical morphemes counted has changed from unacquired to acquired status over a 5-year period. I used this quote at an applied linguistics conference when Dick Schmidt was in the audience a few years ago now. And he said, you can update that now. In the last 25 years of living in an English-speaking environment, Wes has still not acquired these morphemes. That's a single case study. What about larger studies? Again, that was from the US. What about Europe? Well, similar findings from the ESF study of Klein and Perdue, cross-linguistic longitudinal research project, 40 learners of different L1, L2 combinations, heck of a study. Across these different learners, all learning naturalistically, Klein and Perdue said all of them had a very special language form, which we call the basic variety. All learners, independent of source language and target language, developed and used it. About a third of them fossilized at that level. That is, they learn more words, but they didn't complexify their morphology or syntax. Highly efficient for communicative purposes. Most lexical items, nouns, verbs, adverbs. Closed class items, in particular determiners, subordinating elements, and prepositions are rare, if present at all. And Klein, I think trying to be provocative, said, there is no functional morphology whatsoever. No tense, no aspect, no mood, no agreement, no case marking, no gender assignment. So why? Why is morphology so difficult to learn? Why is it easy?
Today.
Why is it easy
Today.
for a second language learner to be able to do that? And why is it difficult for a second language learner to acquire that as the third person singular simple present verb marker in English? And I'm going to be taking a usage-based approach. I'm going to be thinking about the psychology of learning. And I'm going to be thinking particularly about these factors: saliency, contingency, redundancy and overshadowing, attentional factors, and the fact that often there is transfer and blocking from first language knowledge. But you can already see why morphology is difficult. Think particularly about salience.
Today.
Versus, yeah. So I'm going to take you through a number of different studies on morphology acquisition. Let us think first on the nature of the morpheme. Let's think about saliency. There is a general law of language, which is that to be habitual, there's a general law of human behavior, which is that to be habitual, an action must be relatively effortless if we're going to do it again and again and again. This is Zipf's principle of least effort. It leads to simultaneous minimization in the effort of both the hearer and the speaker. And it is that the most frequent words in a language are short. Makes sense? Here's a description of word length and frequency. The most frequent words in English are, what have we got here? We've got the modal length of around about 4 letters. For Swedish, the same. So the most frequent words in a language are short. It doesn't make sense if we have a very useful item of thought sound to have to say anti-disestablishmentarianism every time we want to exchange it. We want to be able to say fire, a short word. Now, closed class grammatical items are the most frequent items in a language overall. The morphemes are the most frequent, the closed class morphemes are the most frequent items in the language. So they get shorter and shorter and shorter, and eventually typically become phonologically fused with the surrounding material. So what does that mean for language learning? Well, there's a general law of learning. It's the most general law of learning, of associated learning. Think Pavlovian conditioning. There's a bell, it's going to signal food. Rescorla and Wagner studied thousands and thousands and thousands of experiments looking at the amount of learning on one trial between a cue, a bell, being associated with an outcome, food. And they summarized all of those studies in one formula, which is that the amount of learning on any one learning trial is a result of A, B, L minus B. We don't have to go into the detail other than to know that A is the salience of the conditioning stimulus. Is it a big loud bell or is it a bell? The salience of the unconditioned stimulus, is it a big bowl of food to a hungry animal, or is it little morsel to a full animal. And these are primary factors in the amount of learning that we're going to get from any one learning trial. Learning depends on the saliency of the cue. It also depends on the importance of the outcome. And this last bit over here is the more predicted the unconditioned stimulus from the context and other usage, the less learning we're going to get from this particular trial. But what we need to remember for now is salience of the sound is what's important. Well, we know that grammatical particles tend to be perceptually non-salient. It's a result of Zipf's law of least effort. So what does that mean for learning the thought sound associated with morphology, the interpretation and the morpheme? Well, as things get shorter, we start with lexis. This is the linguistic cycle. We start with lexis, and things get shorter and shorter and shorter and become morphemes, fused to carrier words. And as they get shorter and shorter and shorter, so different meanings, different thought sounds crash into each other. So many of the most frequently used words are homophones. Think of in English two and two, or there and there, or an I and I. The most frequent words in a language are homophonic. That works for, in this graph, English, German, and Dutch. So as things get shorter, so they all crash into each other. Short words are more homophonous. And that makes a problem for learning, because what drives learning is reliability of association or contingency. If every time the cue is there, the outcome is there, that's a learnable cue. If every time there is no cue, there is no outcome, that's a learnable cue. But the more things are off this major diagonal, the more times the outcome is there when there's no cue, or there's no outcome when there is a cue, then this becomes a low learnable cue. You can summarize this with an association statistic. It's not chi-squared, but it's kind of similar. It's a one-way dependency statistic, delta P. Well, let's think about this contingency and learning morphology. Language is flitting by. And there's lots of sounds in language. Sometimes words just end in but sometimes when they end in it's meaningful, and sometimes that means it's an adjective, and sometimes it means it's a noun plural, and sometimes it means that it's nouns possessive. And you can see that for this sound at the end of words, there is no unitary interpretation. This is a low contingency cue. There are situations of homophony, which take us off the main diagonal. Plural S, third person singular present S, possessive S, are all situations of ambiguity where the cue is there, but it's not that particular outcome. And there are situations of allomorphy where the same cue is expressed in different sounds. So these are low reliability, low contingency systems. Grammatical particles tend to be of low contingency. They're low reliability cues. They will not readily be learned. Finally, and this is the major problem for second language learners rather than first language learners, adults have already learned a language. And whatever that language, it's given them ways, simple ways of communicating things like temporal reference. There are lexical and phrasal ways of last Christmas referring to time in language. There are expressive ways of introducing temporality when you're in face-to-face communications. And these can block lower contingency and more complex grammatical tense morphemes. I'm going to skip this slide for sake of time, but you can read it if you want to come back to it. I want to give you one set of experiments which demonstrate this low saliency of morphology compared to lexis and these aspects of blocking. These were papers in the, I first of all did with EuroSLA in 2010 and 11. We tried to think of the simplest language learning experiment we could. And so we taught adults who had no knowledge of Latin, two-word combinations, where there's a lexical cue to temporality and a morphological cue to temporality. And we would show them pairs of these items and let them know whether these referred to the future, the present, or the past. Now, they could learn that future refers to the lexical item, or they could learn that future is signaled by the morphological item, or they could learn both. What did they learn from this type of exposure? Well, learners from an English language background learned the adverb and hardly the verbal morphology at all. Chinese L1 learners, where Chinese does not use verb inflections, learn the adverb and the verb not at all. Russian speakers, Russian, a rich morphological language, were more inclined to pick up on the verb. Spanish L1 speakers, rich inflectional language with cognate status, are more inclined to pick up on the verb. So we showed examples of, so we showed these effects of saliency and blocking in this tiny little two-word pairing exposure to 36 trials of second language Latin. More recently, with Mearness and Font, we did this, but looking at various aspects of form-focused instruction, where we would pre-train people either in the verb alone, a sort of Van Patten-like processing instruction. If you want people to pick up on a cue, then make it the only cue that's there and make it essential. So we would pre-train on verbs, or we would give people a traditional grammar lesson, telling people about how verb morphology worked, tense verb morphology worked in Latin, or with visual presentation, we would make the morpheme more salient with textual enhancement. This is the grammar instruction, very traditional grammar instruction, very old-fashioned grammar instruction. These were the very PowerPoint slides that we used to train this up in our second language learners. Rather like the effects I've already described, the control group who just saw the two-word exposures picked up on the adverb much more than the morphology. Those in any of the form-focused instruction groups learned the verb cue better, the morphological item better than the lexical item. It worked with the grammar lesson. It worked with making the morpheme salience. It worked with pre-training. But what we did in this study is we monitored learners' eye fixations during these exposures, and we could see whether they were focusing during the usage that they're learning from? Were they focusing more on the lexical items or the morphological item? Every learner had different randomized orders of presentation. What I'm doing here is analyzing out the very first exposure to Latin, the second exposure to Latin, up to the 36th exposure to Latin in these experiments. And what we can see in the control condition is that learners, to begin with, they are attracted by this lexical, by this verbal item. It's large and it's attention grabbing. And in the first few trials, they do indeed concentrate on that. But over time, what you can see is they stop concentrating on the verbal morphology and start to pick up on this more salient lexical item, which very reliably cues tense morphology. Contrast that with the verbal grammar group, who start looking at the verbal morphology and continue using the verbal morphology. The high salience group, who continue to use the verbal morphology. The verb pre-training group, who use the verbal morphology and the lexical items in somewhat more even measure. What did we get from these experiments? Eye tracking shows that morphology isn't attended in processing. That lack of attention results in a lack of implicit learning from usage. We can use different manners of form-focused instruction to successfully focus learners' attention on morphology and usage. When we do this, recruiting learners' explicit conscious processing strategies, it allows them to recognize that there is that's there, or that arbo there, that's doing something useful. And once they've made a pattern recognition unit for that, they can be recruiting that in subsequent usage, in subsequent implicit language processing, updating the statistical tallying and of its frequency of usage and the probabilities of its form function mapping. So I now want to switch in my last quarter of an hour to two more recent studies, one of which has just been published, one of which is under submission. But let me remind you that second language morphology acquisition is slow, gradual, and often incomplete. This is a lovely study of naturalistic acquisition in native Mandarin speakers who have arrived in the US, and Jia and Fuse followed them through over a 5-year period, followed these individuals through over a 5-year period, looking at their naturalistic acquisition of the ing morpheme, third person present s, and past tense ed marking. And you can see that present progressive ing is acquired reasonably quickly. But third person present s is still taking place in some of these individuals over 5 years later. Ditto past tense ed marking. So this is slow, it's gradual, and it looks to me like exemplar-based learning, learning from examples, with the paradigm eventually, if it does emerge, emerging from the collaboration of experiences. So what are the experiences? What are the exemplars that seed acquisition? So now we're thinking about not form-function learning alone, but form-form associations, the associations between morphemes as carried by different lemmas. In this study with Wendy Guo, my collaborator Wendy Guo, we're looking at effects of availability, reliability, and formulaicity. Availability, what's the frequency of the word form, for example, thanked. Reliability, how reliable is that lemma for carrying the ed ending. And so it's the relative frequency of the past tense form of thanked. And formulaicity, how formulaic is the carrier phrase for that morpheme. We look at that in 2 experiments, in experiment 1, and in experiment 2, we look at formulaicity 2. We're going to be looking at the distribution patterns and how those drive acquisition. We're going to be looking at early processing using an elicited imitation test. How do we find out about availability, reliability, and formulaicity? Well, we go to Mark Davis's wonderful corpus of contemporary American English, which allows us to look at an estimate of usage-based effects. You can go to it and you can look at how often in the average language does going appear, how often does giving appear. Here we have 4 morphemes that we're investigating, plotting out the most frequent word forms for these morphemes in terms of their frequency and in terms of their reliability. We got this information from Coker. We took our examples from the 10 most frequent word forms carrying the past tense ed, the most reliable word forms carrying past tense ed, and the bottom 10 reliability forms in the language. You can see how we selected these items for each of the morphemes under consideration. Yeah, if you think about these examples, you can see that they make good sense. So we then built these into sentences. And we had highly proficient living in the US, studying in the US learners, doing elicited imitation tests with these items in sentence contexts. For example,
late Wednesday evening, I thanked him for the lovely flowers.
And we would have them hear that.
Late Wednesday evening, I thanked him for the lovely flowers. Late Wednesday evening, I thanked him for the Late Wednesday evening, I thanked him for the lovely flowers.
Last time. They heard it just once. They then did a semantic judgment task. How sensible is this sentence? Then they had to type in what they'd just heard. And each trial was a randomly chosen sentence of that type. We only scored the sentences where the correct lemma was there, and we scored it correct if they provided the morpheme of interest. We scored it wrong if they didn't provide the relevant morpheme, and we didn't think at all about the sentences where they didn't have the relevant lemma. And we studied these 4 morphemes, varying in the reliability of provision of that morpheme or the availability of provision of that morpheme. We found morpheme differences. Some morphemes are easier than others. Progressive ing is more salient and more easy than plural s. And we showed significant effects of availability and reliability particularly. In a second experiment, we added phrasal frequency, comparing, for example, I thanked him for with Ashley thanked Stephen for a low frequency string. We got our frequencies from Coker. We showed, as before, reliable effects of reliability and availability. But we also showed consistent effects of formulaicity. It's easier to recognize a morpheme when it's in string, which typically carries it, than low frequency string. We call this a phrase superiority effect, similar to the word superiority effect for the psycholinguists out there. We showed these effects across different levels of proficiency, where the effect of availability is pretty much the same at different levels of subject proficiency. But the effects of reliability are much greater at initial stages of learning. And we think that's interesting. So we got interactions between reliability and proficiency. The highly reliable morphemes give us a leg up in early stages of acquisition. And our conclusions in that study is that basically language learners are intuitive statisticians. They're affected by the availability, reliability, and formulaicity of these morphemes in their experience. There are frequency effects at a wide variety of different grain sizes, and these interacting interesting and intricate ways. Acquisition is driven by the probabilistic characteristics of the input. We've just published that in Frontiers in Psychology. The final study I want to talk about today is something that Akira Murakami has been doing with me. I feel very grateful to be working with him on this. Particularly grateful because Akira has been doing these very large-scale learner corpus studies, thinking about morphology amongst other things. He had that lovely paper in SSLA 5 years ago, 6 years ago, showing transfer effects in the acquisition of these morphemes as a function of the L1 background of the learners. And he's built up this exquisite expertise in analyzing very large corpora of written language. And what we're doing in our current studies is looking in FCAMDAT, which has millions of words of learner language, 700 million sentences or more in 1 million plus scripts from 170,000 learners, learners at different levels, lots of different prompt types and language usage types, allowing us to investigate morpheme provision in obligatory contexts in these scripts. In this study, we're trying to get everything as tight as we possibly can. So we've got around about 120,000 obligatory contexts for these 4 morphemes in a large sample of learners and writings, with a decent sample of word types. We're looking at availability and reliability and formulaicity in the normative COCA as estimates of usage. Akira is doing these beautiful moving window calculations of formulaicity, looking at n-grams of 3 size, 4 size, and 5 size, looking at the most formulaic contexts. For example, for kinds, the most formulaic context is the 4-gram all kinds of people, and he can measure these and standardize these across different lengths. And here is some data. Here is provision of past tense CD in obligatory context, past tense CD, progressive ing, third person S, plural S. As a result of learner proficiency, does provision increase as a result of proficiency? Oh, yes, it does. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Does it result as a result of writing number, where there are longitudinal aspects of the same learner over time? Yes, it does. These are simple binary predictions frequency in the language against provision. Does it look like we get effects for ing? Yeah, third person s, yeah, plural s, yeah, it looks like it, but we'll wait and see for using more complex analyses. Reliability is more convincing. Formulaic frequency, not sure really. But Akira then goes on to do absolute cutting edge Bayesian mixed effects regression models, putting in random intercepts for learners and nationalities and forms and topics, random slopes for writing number, etc., etc., etc. And looking at these effects when everything's in the pot. And what can we see for provision in considered writing across a wide variety of learners? We see huge effects of reliability for past tense ed, progressive ing, third person s, plural s. There are huge distributional effects of reliability in predicting whether or not a learner will provide that obligatory morpheme or not. But second language acquisition research has known about effects of reliability for quite some time, thanks to Anderson and Shirai, Kathleen Bardaby-Harlig. I've only just twigged, sorry Kathleen, the subtitle of your wonderful 2000 book, Form, Meaning, and Use. What the aspect hypothesis shows is that some lemmas carry these morphemes better than others. And what's driving that? Well, it's semantics. It's the aspect hypothesis. Interestingly, our work shows that it works across learners at all stages of learning, not just for tense morphology, but it seems to be there for things like plurality too. Semantics is really important in driving morphology. So conclusions, wrapping things up. I will get under the wire in 50 minutes at least. Some conclusions. Morphology is hard because of low salience of the morpheme, because of low contingency, because of those morphemes crashing together as languages evolved. There's low saliency, there's low Q outcome contingency, there's overshadowing and redundancy of morphology by other aspects of the discourse. There's transfer from L1 and blocking. L2 learners already know about phrasal and lexical means to communicating meanings, and these block second language morphology acquisition. This is particularly the case for learners who don't use L1, don't use similar morphological constructions. This means that the morpheme is not attended typically in processing. The eye tracking studies showed that lack of attention in processing leads to lack of implicit learning from usage. We can overcome that with different types of form-focused instruction. I'm not saying that one type of form-focused instruction is any better than any other, just that form-focused instruction can be useful, nay, essential in some aspects of second language acquisition. It can tune learners' attention to different things that they wouldn't otherwise see and concentrate on in processing. Once a construction has been represented, has a pattern recognition unit, it can be recruited in subsequent usage and can then enter into the tallying that underpins the emergence of the language learner system. The effects of availability, reliability, and formulaicity, they're particularly there in ballistic online processing, as in elicited imitation tests. Reliability is a very consistent factor in more considered, conscious construction in second language writing. It's really useful to think about this matrix of association. Language learning is associative learning. And in thinking about morphology, we need to think about the morpheme, the contingency between the morpheme and the interpretation, and the contingency between the morpheme and the lemma that carries it. And our work has shown that all of these are important drivers in usage. Today, I've been talking about recurring contexts of use and taking very much a cognitive psycholinguistic analysis of these factors. Let me reassure you, I don't think that language learning is just that. Language learning is much more than that. And I would refer you to the Douglas Fir Group paper, where we try to integrate this into a much broader set of social and cultural contexts of language, its recurrent use, and the crucial importance of our cooperative here and now communication, because these are the important elements of language use that we learn language from. And I just want to say as well that I did a paper a couple of years ago in the Modern Language Journal, where I talk about essentials of a theory of language cognition, which takes language out of our heads and into our communicative contexts. That's it. I'm 5 minutes over, but I'll shut up now and be open to some questions. It's been a pleasure talking with you today. Thank you.